Now, we've already used some CSS properties in order to apply CSS to our different HTML elements. But in this section, we're going to do a deep dive into some of the most important CSS properties that you'll see and use. And we're going to start with CSS color properties. Some of the color properties you've already seen previously. I've shown you how you can set the background color of a particular HTML element by using the background-color property. And previously we've been setting it to basic colors like red or blue or green. And remember that the way that these CSS rules work is the first part is the property, and the part that comes after the colon is the value that you want to set that property to. So in this case, we're setting the background color of the HTML element, which remember contains everything on our website, so the entire web page, to a color of red. That's what that rule does. Now, there are different types of color properties. There's the background color, but you can also simply use the color property. And what this does is it sets the text color. So always check the MDN docs if you're not sure which property does what. Notice that in this case, we've got two colors which we've named red and blue. Well, how do we know that we can use these colors, and what exactly are they? Well, they're called named colors, and there's a whole bunch of them out there with poetic names like cornflower blue or cadet blue or dim gray, olive drab, etc. And you can find all of them by, of course, going to the developer documentation. If you Google for MDN docs named color, the first link should take you to this web page. Alternatively, you can use this URL as well. And the syntax is pretty simple. You simply use the name of the color. And if you scroll through this table, you'll see all the different colors. And don't worry too much about the CSS level 1 or level 2 or level 3. It just describes historically when each color was introduced. So these were introduced first because it's basically the rainbow. And then over time, we got some more fun colors like cyan and dark khaki and all of these different colors. So you can simply copy the name of the color and paste it into your code, and you'll be able to see that rendered in your website. Of course, even though there's many colors available in the default CSS named colors, but you still sometimes might want to have a more unique color palette. So what do you do in that case? Well, one of my favorite color palettes is colorhunt.co. It's a free tool that's created by designers for designers, and of course for us as well. Here you've got professionally designed color palettes, 4 colors stacked together that would look perfect on any website. You can imagine that if you select any of these random websites, maybe this could be the background color of the website, this could be an H1 color, this could be a subtitle or H2 color, you have accent tones, you have main tones, and you can use all of these colors in your website. But how do we use them if we don't have a name that's attached to it? Instead, we've got all these numbers and letters. What exactly are these? Well, these are hex codes, and they are a way of representing a larger number code for that particular color. So for example, in this case, this is a color purple, which is formed of 3 fractions, red, green, and blue. And these are colors out of 255. So if you imagine a fraction, 93 out of 255 red, 56 out of 255 green, and 145 out of 255 blue. And when you mix all 3 of these primary colors, you can get so many different types of shades. So in this case, we've got 93, 56, 145. So 93 out of 255. 56 green out of 255 and 145, so a little bit more blue, and we end up with exactly the same shade as this purple you see right here. Converting that RGB into a hex code, so a different way of representing that number, we get this particular hex code. What does this mean for you? Well, when you're using something like Color Hunt and you want to apply these different colors to your website, you can simply copy the hex code and use it instead of the name. And even on the MDN docs for the named colors, you can see their hex codes lined up next to the names. And in code, it looks pretty much exactly the same. Instead of the name, you just put the hex code. So now it's time to try an exercise. Go ahead and download this zip file from this current lesson, extract it, and open it inside VS Code. Once you're here, you should see it's a pretty simple website with just 2 elements inside the body, an H1 and an H2. And if we look at the preview, then you can see it's clearly a drab black and white world. We're going to change all of that by adding in CSS colors. So you've got 5 steps that you need to complete here, and you should follow them one by one. And by the end of all 5 steps, you should have a website that looks something like this, with lots of different colors and different background colors as well. Pause the video now and give this challenge a go. All right, so let's walk through the solution together. We've got the background color of the body, which is set to antique white, which is this color right here. And we've got the text color of the H1 set to white smoke. But you can also set the background color of the H1. It's a property that's available on any of the elements, and it simply takes the existing area of that element and colors the background. Now that might have required a little bit of lateral thinking, but hopefully you got there in the end. And notice how in the H1, we've got all named colors, and in the H2, I've asked you to use hex colors. And this is just so that you have practice adding colors using the 2 different methods. Hopefully you got there in the end. Once you're ready, head over to the next lesson and let's learn more about formatting fonts using CSS. Now, in this lesson, we're going to talk a bit more about the different CSS properties that we can set for fonts, so we can change the appearance of the text in our websites. And we've already seen some of them. For example, the color property, which sets the text color. But there's other ones as well, such as the font weight, the font size, and also the font family, which is the typeface that we want to use. Let's explore some of these newer ones. The first one I'll talk about is the font size. We can change the size of a font by simply using the font size property and then setting it to a particular pixel size, as you might have seen me do already. But if we think about it, what exactly does a 20 pixel font size mean? How big is it really? Well, this is how big it is. 1 pixel is about 1/96th of an inch. And the reason why we're using imperial units is because a lot of this sizing for websites and for design work actually comes from the olden days of book printing, book binding, and it was very traditional. If you know how big an inch is, then you know how big 1/96th of an inch is. It's absolutely tiny. But if you have no idea how big an inch is, then in metric units, it's about 0.26 millimeters. That's about how big a pixel is. It's 0.26 millimeters wide and 0.26 millimeters tall. So it's a small cube that's very, very tiny. There are other ways that we can represent the font size when we're writing CSS. One common way that you'll see, in addition to pixels, is using something called a point. A px stands for a pixel, and a pt stands for a point. Now, how big is a point? Well, it's slightly bigger than a pixel. It's about 1/72 second of an inch. So that's just slightly bigger. If 1.96 of an inch is 0.26 millimeters, 1/72 of an inch is about 0.35 millimeters, just a tiny bit bigger. Now, the point is actually often used in many different applications. So when you select a 12 size font in, say, Word, you're actually selecting 12 points. So that means when you're using 12 points on your web page, you can expect that when a website is at 100%, it'll look about the same as a 12 font on your Word document. In addition, there are some other ways of representing font size. The EM and the REM. What are these units? Well, the EM is actually not pronounced EM, it's pronounced M. So it's pronounced in the same way that this letter is in the alphabet. Why is that? Well, one EM is defined as the full width of an M. The letter M is probably one of the widest letters in the English alphabet, and this unit simply represents that entire width. But what does it actually mean when we use it? Well, what it means is that when you set an H1 to have the font size of 1 EM, your CSS code would look something like this, then it means that if it had a parent, for example, if we had a body tag that enclosed this H1 tag, then if this body had a font size of, say, 20 pixels, then this H1, if we set it to 1 EM or 1 M, then it means it's going to be 100% of the parent size. So it means it's going to be 20 pixels. Now, however, if we set it to 2 EM instead, then in this case, it's going to be 2 times the parent size, so 2 times 20 pixels, which is going to be 40 pixels instead. It's basically a relative size. And I'm going to explain to you why this is important very shortly. But closely related to the EM or the M is the REM. And it's got that extra word R. And basically it works the same thing. It's a relative size, but it's now relative, instead of to the parent, it's relative to the root of your HTML file, which, if you remember, the root is usually an HTML element that encloses everything inside. What is the difference then between the EM and the REM? If we take a look at this code where we've got a body tag that encloses an H1, and then we've got a footer tag, which is one of the tags that you can use to define a section in your code for the footer area of your website, then inside here we've got an H2 that's enclosed. If I set my H2 to have a font size of 2 EM, and my footer had a font size of 20 pixels, then 2 EM is 2 times 20 pixels, which is equal to 40 pixels. So this H2 is now 40 pixels. However, if I go in here and I change this footer to have 80 pixels, then all of a sudden this is going to change, and it's no longer going to be 40 pixels, but instead it's going to be 2 times 80, which is now equal to 160 pixels. So it's moving relative to its parent size. On the other hand, if I had set this H2 to have a size of 2 REM, and I change the size of my footer from 20 pixels to 80 pixels, then it does not affect this whatsoever. It still remains the same size. It's only if I change the root element, which, if you take a look, it's the thing that encloses all of the rest of the code, which is normally the HTML element. If I change this size to something larger, say 90 pixels, then that is the thing that will affect this sizing. So the main difference between the REM and the EM is the fact that this is a more consistent way of changing the sizing. So I normally recommend that everybody who develops websites, when you're setting the font size, to use the REM. Because the way that you have different things embedded in others, so this H2 is inside a footer, which is inside the body, which is inside the HTML, then the relationship to the parent can very quickly get very confusing. And you don't know whose parent we're referring to, especially when you're working in a separate CSS file. So understand how the REM works. Remember, it is a scaled size of the root. 1 REM is 1x the root size, 2 REM is 2x the root size, and this is a much easier way to control the different sizes of various elements on your screen and have more clarity around what's going on. In the starting file that you downloaded previously, I've got some sample code for you. If we take a look at all the different ways of setting font size, you can see that we can use the pixel size, we can use point size, we can use REM, and we can also use named font sizes such as extra large or large. And when all of this is rendered, you'll see the different sizes in play. The fact that a pixel is much smaller than a point, but these two are static font sizes. And then the EM is relative to the parent and the REM is relative to the root, but these are relative sizes. If you want to see this code and be able to edit it and change it and see it working, then download the zipped file from this current lesson called 6.1 Font Properties. Once you've extracted it, open it up inside VS Code, head over to fontsize.html, and you'll see exactly the same code as in the demo, but in this case, it's of course in VS Code, so you can change things such as the REM, the EM, the different font sizes, the root font size, and you'll see it reflected on the screen. For example, if I change this root font size from extra large down to say 20 pixels, then you'll see that this paragraph change accordingly because its size is based on REM. So have a play around with that so that you can understand what's going on. There are some other font properties that I want to briefly cover. One is the font weight, which is relatively simple. You can have normal or you can have bold, and we all know what that means. It just makes the font look a bit heavier. But out in the wild, you might see some other ways that people use to change the font weight in addition to the basic keywords. You can have a relative font weight, which is relative to the parent, to have the font lighter or have it be bolder. In addition, you can also use a number from 100 up to 900 to determine how light or how bold you want the font to be. And similarly, when we say lighter, it basically minuses the number by 100. And if we say bolder, it just makes it bolder by 100, somewhere along this range. In addition to font size and font weight, there's also the all-important font family. And this determines what you want your text to look like. For example, in this first example, we've got the font family that is set to Helvetica. This is a particular typeface. And the name is called Helvetica, but this is a Mac-specific typeface. So there are many Windows computers that do not own this typeface. That's why very often when we write a font family, we don't just write the font name. We have a comma, and then we have a backup generic font type. So in this case, it's a sans serif. A sans serif is simply the type of font where all the edges are pretty much at right angles. If you had these little feet or these little decorations at the edges of your letters, then very often what you're looking at is a serif type font. So that's the main two types of different typefaces. And in later lessons, we cover typefaces in more detail. So you can either search for that lesson or wait until it comes up to learn more about that. What is important though is having this generic typeface. This means that when you have this set, that Mac users will see this font, but Windows users will see something that's relatively equivalent and it'll be automatically displayed for them when it doesn't work. Now, what if you have a font that has many words in it? For example, Times New Roman consists of 3 words. Well, in this case, we can't simply just type it out like this and then have a comma. We actually need the quotation marks around it so that we can tell the CSS file that there are spaces in the name of the font family. So just be careful about that when you're using it. And because Times New Roman is a serif type font, then the backup, the generic type, is also a serif. Now, what if you want a completely custom font that maybe the user doesn't have? Well, one of the best places to find free fonts is going over to fonts.google.com. And here you can find all sorts of different fonts, and there are so many for you to choose from, and you can browse to your heart's content. Now, I want you to do this with me. Go over to fonts.google.com, find a font that you like. So maybe I really like a particular font, and if you click on it, sometimes you'll see that it has different font faces for the different weights. So there's bold, which is 700, or regular at 400. But then other fonts you might see in here doesn't actually have any weights other than just the regular one that you can use. Depending on which of these type you have, simply select the weight that you're interested in. For example, with this font, maybe I want the medium size. And with this font, maybe I'm just going to select a regular one. And once you've selected that, if you go to the top right corner, you can see all of your selections. So you can remove all, or you can remove the ones that you're not interested in. But either way, you should end up with a font that you want to include. Now make sure that that link is selected and then copy that over to your starting file. So select the fontfamily.html. Inside the head element, just after the style tag, go ahead and paste all of that in. And this is basically a link that is going to pull in the Google font for any user on the internet. So it doesn't matter if they have a Mac or a PC or which fonts they have downloaded on their computer, they'll all be able to access this font because we're including it in the link. And then let's go ahead and copy the CSS rule, which Google has very helpfully included for us. And if you scroll up, you'll see that I've again got an internal style set in here so that we can more easily see the CSS alongside the HTML on the same file while we're doing the exercise. Let's go ahead and create an H1 here, and I'm simply going to write the words font family because that is what this page is all about. And then let's right click and show it in the preview. Now I want you to set the H1's CSS style to the one that you just copied over. Pause the video and do that right now. All right, so we need to target the H1, of which we've only got one, so we can use the element selector, and then we paste in our CSS style, as easy as that. And you'll notice immediately that updates that font into our custom font from Google. And it doesn't matter what you've chosen, this should always work as long as you've included all of the links that are required and added in the relevant CSS. Also on this page, you'll see the different font families, for example, the Helvetica and the sans serif, or on a Windows, the default sans serif will be an Arial type font. And then you've got serif type fonts, which are the ones with the little feet that I mentioned. You've got these sans serif fonts, and you've got all of these other generics, such as cursive, monospace, and fantasy. Cursive is a little bit curly, that's how I remember it. Monospace has all the letters occupying the same width, so similar to a typewriter or code. And fantasy is usually something kind of wild. And these generic fonts will be different depending on the computer that you use and the browser that you use. So you might not see the same type of fonts that I have here. But if you specify a specific font and you make sure that it's linked to, then we should all be looking at the same font face right up here. And notice how when we copy that over, it specified the specific font, but also a backup font in case these links didn't work or something messed up, and it would default to a cursive font. The generic cursive font would then look like this. So the final thing I want to talk about in terms of text styling is alignment. So text alignment. And there's this property called text align where you can set it to say centered, or you can set it to the left or to the right. And you've also got some values like start and end. And basically start is when you have text that maybe starts writing from the right to left, such as in Arabic. And so in this case, the start is actually here and the end is here. But then if you're working with Western text, then the start will be right here and the end will be right here. That's just a more flexible way of determining the text align. But all in all, this is a pretty simple property. And you can take a look at it in the MDN docs to learn more about what the other values in addition to start, end are, and try the demo to see how they work. Now, once you've done all of that, I've got a final exercise for you, and that's located in the index.html here. There's a number of to-dos I want you to complete, and I want you to go through them one by one. It involves changing some colors, changing some font sizes, font weight, font family, the text align, and also changing a root element font size. The important thing is that you don't change any of the CSS that's already included, but instead write your CSS below in this internal style element so that you can quickly refer to the to-dos and see what you need to write in the CSS. Don't worry too much about setting external CSS. We're just completing this as a quick exercise. And remember, while you're doing this, if you want to see what the end result should look like, go ahead into the goal.png to see all the colors and layout and relative sizes of everything. Pause the video now and go through each of these to-dos. All right, so let's go through the solution together. Now, step one was to change the color of this particular element to a named color called coral, and the solution should look something like this. The second one is to change the font size of this element to 2 times the size of the root element. Remember, to do that, we have to use the REM, and 2 times the size is 2 REM. I've selected it based on the size ID, and I've changed the font size to that. The next step, I've changed the font weight of this element to 900 by using the font weight property. And then we changed the font family of this element to use the caveat font with a regular font weight. So I selected that font from there, and then I added in all the required links just before the end of the head section, but outside of the style section. This is very important in terms of placement. And then I added in the font family and a backup font in case it goes wrong. Next, I changed this particular paragraph element so that it's right aligned. And finally, I changed the root, which is the HTML element, to have a 30 pixel font. And when that was changed, then the 2 REM one, which is the font size element here, actually changes with it. So it gets bigger or it gets smaller, depending on the root size. So hopefully that was easy enough for you to complete, and it tested you on all the things that we learned in this lesson so far. Once you're ready, head over to the next lesson where we're going to learn more about CSS inspection and how you can find out what is happening with your CSS using the Chrome developer tools. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. Hey guys, welcome to another lesson where we learn more about CSS. Now, in this lesson, we're going to deep dive into CSS inspection and learn about the Chrome developer tools that allow us to figure out what our CSS is doing and potentially diagnose any bugs or resolve any issues. As I mentioned before, the Chrome developer tools are a really powerful suite of tools that is completely free and comes bundled with the Chrome browser. If you are not using a Chrome browser, you won't get access to it, and it's really important, at least for this course, that you've got the same browser as I'm using so that we can go through these tools together. If you head over to this URL, which we visited before in the last section where I showed you how CSS works and how we can simply add CSS to make our website look beautiful, then we can use this as an example to learn more about CSS inspection. In order to bring up the Chrome Developer Tools, we go over to these three dots and then we go to More Tools and we go to Developer Tools. Now you'll notice that on the right-hand side of this selection, you have the shortcut for your computer on how you can bring it up quickly. On a Mac, it's usually set by default to Command, Option, and I. On Windows, it's normally Control plus Shift plus I, so holding down those three keys together. But if you have the function keys up here, pressing F12 usually also brings up the Chrome Developer Console. But the shortcut could be totally different for you, so make sure you take a look over here to figure out what your precise shortcut is. Another way of bringing up this Developer Console is simply to right-click on any element you're interested in, for example this button, and then click on Inspect. And it will do the same thing, but in addition, it will highlight in the HTML that element that you selected. Now, what if you wanted to select a different element while you're here? Well, you can use this button up here to select an element visually. So you can click that and then say, okay, I want to look at the footer here, this paragraph. Well, then it will select it for you in the HTML. Or I want to look at this H1. So you can select it visually, or you can select it using the HTML. This is the Elements tab, and we're going to be exploring a subsection of this, which is the Styles section. Notice that when I select any of these elements, it shows me the styles that have been applied to those elements. For example, if we take a look at this button, at least in the CSS on version, you'll see that it's got a background color that I've set a color for the text, and lots of other things that we don't need to worry about too much right now, because in the next lesson, we're going to learn more about different CSS properties. But the important thing is that notice if I go ahead and press that button and switch off all the CSS, and I select that button again, then you can see that most of the element style is actually all automatic. Whenever you insert a HTML element, it comes with automatic preloaded CSS, and that's what you're getting by default. It looks something like this. But when you actually apply your own CSS, then it gets shown here, and you can even see which file it's coming from. In this case, it's the styles.css right here. And you can click on it to view the source code of that CSS. The next thing I want to show you is how you can actually change the CSS live in the Chrome Developer Tools. Right now you can see I've got my H1 selected, and by simply clicking Add, I can add a style to this H1. So I could say, let's change its color instead of white to maybe black instead. And you can see that reflected live over here. Now I can switch that off by hovering over here and clicking on the button to put a slash through it, and it deletes that CSS. Now the important thing to remember is any of the changes that you make in the Chrome Developer Tool does not affect your original file. Previously, remember when we looked at TechCrunch using the Chrome Developer Tools, and we were able to change the text by simply typing in the Chrome Developer Tool. This does not change TechCrunch's website, and some of you have asked, is this illegal? Am I doing something bad? No, it doesn't. It's just you affecting your local copy that's loaded up inside the Chrome browser. It doesn't affect any of the other users, and certainly doesn't change anything on TechCrunch's servers. Similarly, back over here, when we're editing the CSS, when we are selecting or unselecting or adding new rules, it doesn't affect the actual website. Even if you load up one of your local websites that you're developing and you change a whole bunch of things, this is just temporary. It's for you to look and try things out and see how you like it before you add these rules into your actual CSS source code. And you can further confirm this by seeing that I've got an H1 that says color black, but if I go into the sources, my style.css for this file, and I look in this file, you can see that nothing has changed here. there is no H1 that has a color of black. Again, I recommend don't worry too much about the different properties. There's lots of them that's coming up that we're going to talk about. But the main thing to focus on here is how to use the inspector to understand other people's as well as your own websites and how the CSS is laid out. If you go ahead and inspect on one of these anchor tags, so when you click this and hover over it, you should see an A tag show up. So click on it and it'll select it in the HTML. Now, if you look over here, you can see that it's got some default properties that have been striked out. And the reason for this is because when we apply a CSS rule that conflicts with some of the automatically applied rules, such as the color of that anchor tag. Remember, by default, the color of any anchor tag is blue to start with, but here we've got one that's white. Well, we've overridden it simply with this line. So if I switch this off, you can see the other one switch back on. But if I do have my own rules, then it can override other existing rules. So how do you know what's actually being applied to your CSS element? Well, that's where the computer tab comes in. Because when you click on it, you'll see the actual color in terms of RGB, so how much red, green, and blue is being applied to the text color, and other properties as well. And it removes all of the craziness of all this crossing out stuff, and you can actually see in one place what is being applied. Now, another feature of Chrome Developer Tool that I find really useful is to go over to the three dots, go to More Tools, and remember this is the three dots for the settings of the Chrome Developer Tools, not the one for Chrome. This is easily confused. But when you go here and you go to More Tools, you should find CSS Overview. And this is a neat feature where you can select Capture Overview, and it'll show you a bunch of useful things. Like, for example, that there are two background colors here. There's a sort of whitish gray and there's a sort of purple going on. There's two different text colors, white and black. And we've also got information on the different fonts that are being used on the web page. I find this really neat when I come across a website that I really like and I'm trying to figure out, oh, what font is that? Well, it seems like they're using Helvetica Neue. Or what color is this green exactly? Well, I can actually find out simply by looking at this inspector, and maybe I can copy it for my own use later on. So you can see the colors, you can see the fonts, and for now we won't worry too much about the last two. We'll come to that in later modules. Have a play around with the CSS inspector. And I want you to take a look at selecting different elements, looking at their styles, trying to add some styles in the Chrome Developer Tool, and looking around at some of the other things we've mentioned. Once you're happy that you know how to do that, I want you to head over to this URL at brewery.github.io/CSS-inspection. And I've created a website for you to inspect. In this website, we've got some things that are on the screen, and this is an H1, an H2, and a paragraph tag. Now, I want you to use the CSS inspector to answer these 4 quiz questions. And once you put in the answer, click submit, and you'll see if you got it right or if you got it wrong. Pause the video and try to complete this challenge. All right, so the first question is, what is the named color of the body? Well, what is the color? So let's go ahead and pull up our inspector and let's select the body element if we haven't already got it selected in the HTML. And let's take a look at what styles are applied. You can see it's got a background color that's being applied. And if we switch it off, you can see it changes it to the default, which is white. So this is the background color of the body and it's called Alice Blue. If I type that in here and click submit, then I get my answer correct. Now let's move on to the second question. What's the font size of the H1? Let's select the H1 right here and let's take a look at the font size that's mentioned here. Well, it says it's 3 rem, which makes it a lot bigger than the default. So let's type 3 rem in here, hit submit, and we got that question right too. Number 3 is, what is the font weight of the H2? select the H2, look at the font weight, it's font weight 500. Okay, and hit submit. And finally, what's the font family of the paragraph tag? So let's select the paragraph tag and then look at the font family. And this is a little bit tricky because it's actually not applied directly to the paragraph, but it's actually one of the automatically inherited parts. So you can see down here, it says the font family. And also if you go to computed, where everything's all stacked up together, as I mentioned, where you don't have to go through the entire list of what's being striked out, what's being applied, etc. You can see the font family is Arial, sans serif. So Arial, sans serif, and hit submit. And we get all our answers correct. So did you manage to do that? Did you manage to use the inspector to figure out the answers to these questions? If not, be sure to review the previous parts of this video so that you understand exactly what's going on before you move on to the next lesson. Hey guys, in this lesson, we're going to talk about some other really important CSS properties. And they're ones that you might have already seen if you've been doing a little bit of CSS inspection around the internet. And these are margin, padding, and the border properties. And these three properties, along with width and height, form a really important CSS concept known as the box model. So what exactly is it? Well, if you think about a typical website, here I've created one called I Love Bacon, then you've got different components that are on screen, different HTML elements. And even though we can't really see it, effectively, each element is a box in itself. And we can change the dimensions of those boxes by changing things such as width and height. So in this case, I've made my bacon much, much bigger. And that invisible box around the element describes how it would be laid out on screen. If we have an element that has a height of 300 pixels, we can change that height to allow our element to take up more vertical spacing on the web page. And when this happens, it pushes the box of any other elements lower on the web page. Now, similarly, we can also change the width of an element to allow it to take up more space horizontally. And we can either do this using pixels as defined here, or we can use percentages. So in this case, we've gotten our blue element to take up the entire width of the website. And that can be done using percentages. In addition to width and height, we can also set a border on each of the HTML elements. If you imagine, again, each HTML element being a box, then this would be the border of the box. And the way that the border property works is a little bit different from what you might have seen before. It can take three values separated by a space. The first value that you should provide is the thickness of the border. And this, as you can see here, is the thickness of this line. If I made it thicker, then it would look like this. And so we can provide a pixel value for the thickness as the first item. Now, the second item is the style of the border. You can have, for example, solid, but you can also have a dashed line, in which case the border would look something like this instead of a solid line as we've gotten here. And finally, we've got the color of the border, in which you can set to any named color or hex color, as we've covered in the color properties lesson. These three items together determine what the border should look like. So if I was to change the border from 10 pixels to 30 pixels, then we would get a lot thicker of a border. But remember, the important thing is that the height and the width of your HTML element, your box, does not change. It's exactly the same as what it was before. So this border actually goes outwards rather than inwards. And that's the important thing to remember here. Now, once you've defined a border, you can further modify it with more specific rules. So for example, in this case, I've got a all round 30 pixel solid black border around my element, but then afterwards on the next line, and this is very important where this line goes, it has to go after the point where we've created the border. In this case, I'm saying I want the top of that border to be 0 pixels instead. Well, the way that these rules are evaluated is first they will look at this line, creating this border, which is 30 pixels all around. But then once it lands on the next line, it evaluates this rule and sees that actually I should amend the top of the border to have 0 pixels. So effectively getting rid of the border at the top here. This border width works similarly to the way that the border property works, namely that it can take a maximum of 4 values. The first value is the top, the second is the right, third is the bottom, and the fourth is the left. It goes in a clockwise direction. In addition, you can also just provide 2 values for the border width. And what that does is it sets 1 and 3, and then it sets 2 and 4. For example, if my border width I had set to 0 pixels and 20 pixels, then what that would do is it would set 2 and 4, which is the left and right, to 20 pixels, and then it would set 1 and 3 to 0 pixels. This then becomes top and bottom. And then we've got our left and right. Now, another property I want to talk about in regards to the box model is something called padding. And this is most easily seen when we have content such as text. So in this case, imagine that this blue box is a paragraph element. And in the paragraph element, we've got hello world repeated many, many times. This paragraph element has got a border property, and it's a solid black border measuring 30 pixels wide all around. If at this point I add a padding property to this element, then what would happen is it would push my border out by 20 pixels. And in this case, I'm pushing it by 20 on all sides. And notice how, again, in this situation, the height and the width of this box does not change. It's still the same. The padding simply adds this padding or space between the element and the border. In addition to the padding, there's also something known as a margin. And the margin is actually the part that's outside of the border. So here again is the border. In between the border and the width and height of the element is the padding, and the part between the border and any other content that's on screen is the margin. So in this case, we've added a margin of 10 pixels on all 4 sides. If you imagine we had 2 elements, each with the same padding, margin, and border, then this margin, or this distance between the 2 elements, in this case will actually be 20 pixels, because it's 10 pixels from this side and 10 pixels from this side. And it adds this spacing between elements that you would not get with the padding. So that is the main difference. In your CSS inspection, you might have seen the box model already shown in the CSS inspector. And it shows you the margin, the border, the padding, and the width and height. So that's what all of these different colors represent. And when you take a look at the box model on inspection, then you can actually change each of these values to see how it would look differently. If you head over to this address, appbury.github.io/box-model, and then we go ahead and open up the developer tools, and we select on the first image here, which shows a daytime world, and we go into the box model that's under the Styles tab, if I go ahead and add a margin right here, let's say, I don't know, 100 pixels, then it's going to add that gap. Did you see it just now? That gap between that image and anything that's below it. And similarly, if I add a little bit of a margin above, say 100 pixels, then you can see it adds a gap between that image and the next element above, which is that paragraph tag. However, if I added the padding as 100 pixels, then you'll see it add the space as well, but it's actually inside the border of the image. If this element actually had a border, which we'll set as 10 pixels solid black, then you can see how that padding goes to a different place versus where the border goes. And this box model is going to come really, really handy when you start to try and lay out different items on your website, determining how they look and where they're placed relative to each other. The final thing I wanted to mention is that padding and margin, similar to what we saw for the border and also the border width, function in that same way where we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4 values that we can provide. And if we provide a different value for each of them, so 0, 10, 20, and 30 pixels, then this will determine how it looks on all 4 sides. And you have to remember that this is where the first value is, second, and it goes around in a clockwise direction. Again, with the border width, you can change to only provide 2 values. So say 10 pixels and 40 pixels, then this is going to be applied to the top and the bottom, and also the left and the right. So this is just a particular way of how these 3 properties can accept multiple values. If you only set one value, say 10 pixels, then that's going to affect all sides. In addition to the boxes that are created by elements, we can actually create our own boxes independent of that. And that's really useful when we want to group different bits of content together so that we can style it together, or maybe we want to lay it out together. For example, here we have an image, and maybe I would want the image to have a caption. And I would probably want to style these 2 bits together so I can wrap a box around these 2 elements. And the way that I would create these artificial boxes is through the use of a HTML element, which is called the content division element. There was no point learning about the div element before we could learn about CSS, because these are completely invisible unless you apply CSS style to it. And the whole purpose is to act as an invisible box that can contain content in between the opening and the closing tags. In the middle, we can put as many elements as we want, and we can group them into separate boxes known as divs. So here I've got the HTML code from that website I showed you earlier with the 2 versions of our world, the morning and the evening view. And it's really simple, and I've only just taken the body section of the HTML. But here notice that we've got a paragraph tag and an image tag, and they're grouped together through the use of this div element. And notice that the div element doesn't really do anything else other than act as a container to group this section together so that it's separated from other content, for example, this section right here. And now we've not only added meaning to our HTML by saying this is one section of content and this is another section of content, but in addition, we can style them differently in CSS. When we run our code, this is what the website would look like. You would not see any of these div elements. But if we were able to see them, then they would look like this, grouping our elements together. Because these divs are invisible, sometimes it can be really hard to debug them and understand what's going on, or more likely what's going wrong with your CSS. So there's a free Chrome extension that I recommend you download to make this process of debugging a little bit easier, and hence that's why it's called Pesticide. We're going to use it to get rid of bugs in our CSS. I'll add a link to this Chrome extension, and all you have to do is click Add to Chrome and then Add Extension. And once you've got it, then you should be able to look inside your extensions and then open it up to activate it. Now, what does it do? Well, let's demo it. In addition to the suite of developer tools you've got, now you've also got the Pesticide working for you. And once you activate it, you can see these div boxes now show up on screen. And you can also see the different elements highlighted in boxes, and it really helps you diagnose what's wrong with your box model when it does go wrong. In addition, if you close down the Chrome developer tools and hold down the Control key, when you hover on each of these boxes, down at the bottom of the screen, you can see how it tells you which node you're actually hovering on. So in this case, I'm inside a div, and it shows you if there are any classes or IDs on that div as well. And then here I'm hovering on an image element, and here I'm hovering on a paragraph element. And this can be really helpful for you to see exactly what's on screen and almost like put on night vision goggles so that we can see our divs and our elements and their alignment and their sizing. Finally, we're going to use everything that we've learned and put it all together in this exercise where we're going to write some code and apply our knowledge. Go ahead and download this zipped file from this current lesson, extract it, and open it inside VS Code. Now, once you've done that, open up the index.html and you should see a bunch of to-dos. I want you to follow each of the steps one by one, just as if you were a web developer following client instructions. And we're going to use everything you've learned so far in order to create something that looks like this. Now, I've marked up this page a little bit so I can show you the important parts of the requirements. For example, notice that here I've said 20 pixel padding, and that applies to the distance between that paragraph tag and the border. And then here I've said it should have a 20 pixel border at the top and at the bottom, but then only a 10 pixel border on the left and the right. And notice that the layout is very specific here. Each of these boxes should be touching corner to corner. So you're going to have to figure out how to use the margin property in order to push these boxes around so that they're literally aligned right up to each other on the same pixel. I'm going to leave you to pause the video and go through each of these requirements, and hopefully you would be able to create a website that looks like the goal image. Pause the video now and complete this challenge. All right, so let's go through the solution together. Now, the first thing you'll notice is we've created 3 divs, and I've added a paragraph tag into the first div so that we can see our padding a bit more easily. The next thing is we've set each of the divs height and width to a pixel size, namely 200 pixels. Next, I've added a paragraph element inside the first div so that we can see any padding that gets added very easily. And I've set the first div to have 20 pixels of padding all around with a black 10 pixel border. And that you can see under here. Now notice how I've used different IDs for the different boxes or divs. And this way I can uniquely identify each div and set different styling to them. Next step, I've targeted the paragraph element so that I remove any of the margins that go on it. Because if we preview our solution and open this up inside Chrome, you can see that by default, each paragraph element actually gets 1 EM of margin at the start and the end. So if I cancel this, you can see how it pushes that away from the containing div. So we wanted to add the 0 margin so that we would have it centered and it would not be affected by its default styling. Next, we had you set the second div to have a 20 pixel border, top and bottom, and 10 pixel border, left and right. And if you remember from the lesson, this is achieved through that multi-value method of setting border width. So the first value is top and bottom, and then after a space, we have the second value for the left and right. And even if you hover over this, usually VS Code is quite helpful for pulling up the MDN reference on this, and it tells you how the rules work. So that's a quick tip. Finally, we set the third div to have a 10 pixel border, and I wanted you to set the margins so that they would each touch corner to corner. Now that could be done either by trial and error. Alternatively, you can also work it out, because if you think about this first div right here, it's got a width of 200 pixels. So this part is 200. But in addition, it's also got a border of 10 pixels all around. So then we have to add 10 and 10 here. Now that takes us up to 220. But in addition, remember that we added 20 pixels of padding all around. So then there's 20 here and 20 here. So then if we add it all up, 200 plus 20 plus 20 plus 10, 10, that ends up with 260 pixels. So then we know that we have to push this second div over by 260 pixels, and we can do that using the margin left setting, which is how we managed to push this box over. And in a similar way, we can work out how much to push this third box as well. I hope this challenge was sufficiently challenging enough for you, but don't worry if it's not, because there's way more challenging layouts that are coming up in the rest of the course, and you're going to be able to flex your box model muscles in the coming sections as well. But once you're ready and you've reviewed your code and fixed any errors, head over to the next lesson where we got the final project for the section. All right, so for the final project, we're going to be building a motivational poster website, and we're going to make our own memes. You might have seen some of these around the internet. There are the serious ones, which are based off these 90s motivational posters where you have some sort of title and you have some sort of motivational text like potential. We all have the tools for greatness within us. And I believe that is true. And you've got a cute little Arctic fox. But also there are some pretty hilarious ones like coolness. You may be cool, but you'll never be 4 popped collars cool like this guy. So the goal is to make our own website where we can create our own motivational poster. The important part of a motivational poster is there is an image that is going to be big. There is a border around the image. So we now know all about borders and we can do that. We have a black background, and that is easy because we know all about CSS color properties. We have a big main title, which we're going to use a custom font for to mimic this font a little bit better. And finally, we have a paragraph at the bottom. And we're going to figure out how we're going to center things on the screen, how to add borders, and how to apply basically everything that we've learned so far in this section. Go ahead and download the starting project files for the Motivation Meme project and extract it, and then open it up inside VS Code. I've created the task in a sort of to-do list breakdown for you. Now, the main thing is that it's your website, it's your project, and as with all the projects in the course, it's totally up to you how you want to create it. But there are some caveats, and it's important that you touch all of the learning points. So these 6 points are important, and after completing these 6 points, you can change your website, you can mess with it however you like, but I want to make sure that everything you've learned so far has consolidated and it all makes sense. We're going to use a custom font from Google called the Libre Baskerville, which looks somewhat similar to the motivational main title font. You should add your own image into the images folder under the assets folder. I've got an example image in here for you just in case you want to use it, but I recommend putting in your own images just for practice. And that image should have a 5 pixel white border. And the text should be center aligned, and you should adjust the margin so that the image and text are centered on the page. Now, this is going to be the trickiest part because centering elements using CSS is a whole science in itself, but we're going to do it simply. We're going to horizontally center the div by giving that div a width of 50% to take up 50% of the screen. And then if you think about it, there's only 25% left on each side. So if we have a margin left of 20% on that div, then it should push it into the center. In addition, you might find it useful to set the image to have a width of 100% so that it fills the entire container div, so that you're not having to center the image along with the div. Some of these hints are only going to make sense once you get started writing the code for it, so don't worry too much about it now. I'm just highlighting certain points in the to-do so that when you get to it, to pay more attention to these parts and these helpful tips, which you'll probably need because especially this point number 5, it's quite a difficult task and it will take some time for you to figure out how to get it to look like this. And if you want to push the div down vertically, then I recommend just adding a top margin to push it down by a pixel amount. It doesn't have to be spot bang in the middle of the center, because as I said, that is a whole science in itself, and we're going to be covering it in coming sections, but it's just a little bit more complicated. So we're going to judge it by eye for this project for now. In order to get something that looks like the goal image, I recommend putting the H1, the paragraph, and the image inside a div. That way you can center the div on the screen and you won't have to mess with all 3 elements and their centering, which is already a hard enough task. Finally, you're going to use your developer doc reading skills and learn by yourself about a property called text transform and figure out how to make the H1 look uppercase like what I've got in the solution goal website. All of these elements are on screen. We've got the white border around the image, we've got the black background, the white text, the custom font, and our H1 is totally in uppercase without us having to type it in uppercase. So that's where that text transform property comes in. And notice how this entire content div is roughly somewhere in the center, horizontally and vertically, just judging it by eye. It's not perfect, but as long as you find the perfect avocado, everything else is easy in life. Pause the video now and complete this project. And once you're done, come back and I'm going to walk through the solution code with you. All right, so hopefully that wasn't too hard. If we take a look at the solution HTML, you can see that I've completed all of those tasks with a small HTML and a small CSS file. So it shouldn't be too hard. Now, some of the steps are pretty self-explanatory, but there's a couple of things I want to just briefly touch on. One is you will need the Google font links in the head section if you want to be able to have that custom font on screen. And this is the custom font. In addition, we want to have all our elements inside a div so that we can style it all together, and that's quite important in terms of positioning. So I've created a class for the div. In this case, you could have also used an ID, but if you were going to extend this website, then it's safer to use a class so that you might be able to reuse the CSS in the future. The poster is the part that is more or less center aligned, and we use that trick with setting its width and setting its margin using percentages to get it more or less in the horizontal center. And then I simply set a 100 pixel margin top, just judging it by eye to get it somewhere in the middle. And I added the custom font and the border to the image and made the image 100% wide so that it would fit fully into that poster div. If you had any problems, this is a time where you can look at the solution code and look at your own code and see if there's any fixes you want to make. And once you have, then you can also modify the website any way you like to personalize it and make it your own.